NATO is essentially, on a suicide mission. NATO, of course, has over the last few weeks done things like tell all of its members that they're going to have to increase their budget. Now in Bucharest, Romania, NATO met with Antony Blinken, of course, because the U.S. is really at the head of NATO, really in charge of NATO. They all met and they said, and this is from Chinese media, they said that Ukraine is going to be a part of NATO. And so a lot of people have said, well, that will never happen. That will never happen. Well, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon necessarily. But indeed, NATO vowing support for Ukraine is a serious thing. This is since 2008, right, where NATO has been doing this. And of course, NATO was heavily involved in the 2014 coup, which laid the basis for the current conflict going on. But this is not an unserious topic. This is not an unserious subject. It's not just words. NATO does have plans to admit anyone, because when NATO admits countries into its so-called military alliance, what it's doing is it's building more and more vassals of the United States' military empire. And surely there is absolutely nothing that goes against the interest. If they'll admit Turkey, because the EU won't admit Turkey, but NATO admitted Turkey. So if they'll admit Turkey, then surely just because Ukraine is a small Eastern European country with deep relationships with Russia, it doesn't matter. NATO is serious about this. So this is the latest escalation that NATO has essentially expressed, this time in Romania. So here you have Antony Blinken meeting with Stoltenberg and the crew. So NATO's foreign ministers pledged to continue to support Kiev at a meeting in Romania, despite many member states having already exhausted their military reserves and undergoing energy and price crises. And as such, a generalized political consensus is easiest to achieve when bloc members disagree over concrete action. So this is Chinese observers. The reason why I'm reading you it from here is because it's a short report, but also you get the Chinese perspective, which is very important. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg outlined the key decisions taken by NATO foreign ministers at their meeting in Bucharest on Tuesday, underlining that the meeting sends a strong message of NATO unity and of sustained support to Ukraine. Stoltenberg said that NATO recognizes and respects Ukraine's aspirations for membership. However, the focus is on providing immediate support as Ukraine defends itself against Russia. So there you have it. NATO is committed to admitting Ukraine, but the war has to be over, right? Ukraine has to be protected from Russia first. That's the caveat here, because admitting Ukraine into NATO would be a signal to Russia of all-out war. That's really at the root of this current conflict. So, of course, they're not going to verbalize that they're going to do this anytime soon. They put in this placeholder saying, well, as long as there's a conflict going, we need to focus on that. But the message is clear. The message is that despite Ukraine asking for 4 or 5, however many times more ammunition, artillery, weaponry from NATO than what exists, despite all of these contradictions, the fact that Zelensky could essentially, in the Ukrainian military intelligence, could essentially conduct false flags and provoke Russia, right? This missile attack on Poland, this accident on Poland, which led to Ukraine's government and Zelensky clamoring for the Article 5 of NATO's constitution to be triggered, meaning that NATO members would be essentially forced to intervene on Ukraine's behalf. I mean, this is very serious, right? So they are very serious, and there's a lot of people, liberals especially, who don't take the NATO enlargement, NATO encirclement question seriously. A lot of liberals, especially, mostly neoliberals, but really there isn't much of a difference these days. Many of them, what they do is they say, well, Russia has no real concern, no reason to be concerned, because Ukraine will never be part of NATO, and NATO is not a threat to Russia. One, it's ridiculous to say NATO is not a threat to Russia. First of all, not only has NATO continuously crept along Russia's border, admitted former Soviet Union states, Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, Romania, right? Not only this, but NATO has broken the promise that was made, right, that the United States made to Russia not to enlarge NATO. But also, NATO has been involved in wars that have directly led to this moment. Over and over and over again, NATO has intervened in the Middle East. You all know about Yugoslavia. All of that is a threat to Russia as well because it led to this moment, right? The more that NATO has carved out space for itself, space for domination to destabilize the world, the less secure Russia is, the more threatened it feels. And so there's no reason to believe for Russia that NATO is not a threat. All of the exercises in Norway, across Eastern Europe, the Trident juncture exercises, all these huge NATO exercises happen in this region, and a lot of times they're exercising for war with Russia. So how can Russia not feel threatened that a nuclear-armed military alliance encroaching on its border is somehow not a threat? I don't know how Russia could possibly feel any differently. And after the 2014 coup in Ukraine, NATO came even closer to the border of Russia, given the fact that Ukraine is essentially already a NATO protectorate. It may not be a NATO member, but it's a NATO protectorate. So Stoltenberg, as well as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, said in a meeting, the meeting was also aimed at addressing the challenges China poses to NATO. Blinken, in a short speech ahead of the meeting, underscored the concept of unity and alliance, according to the release of the White House. Zhang Hong, an associate research fellow at the Institute of Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, believes there is a new peak of antagonism amid airstrikes on key infrastructure of Ukrainian cities, knocking out power and water services. So, yeah, I mean, that's a big reason why we're hearing about NATO and Ukraine, okay? Because NATO feels like it needs to pledge more support to Ukraine because Russia is, in fact, winning. Russia is, in fact, doing a whole lot to achieve its objectives. Now, it's not necessarily the fastest development. It's not necessarily something that's happening today. There is this slow grind. The winter is likely to see offensives, right? Because that's the time Russia will have to strike with its mobilization. The terrain will be a lot more complicated because of weather conditions. All of this plays a role. And Russia has recently conducted in the last few weeks and since October, really, a flurry of missile strikes on Ukraine, knocked out about 70% of its electricity infrastructure and, of course, other infrastructure as well, in order to demilitarize. That is what the goal has been from the beginning, and that's what is happening. You demilitarize, in order to demilitarize Ukraine, it can't have power. And that might sound absolutely horrific because it does have a civilian cost. But this is kind of the bed that Ukraine's military has made. And of course, NATO has made first and foremost by provoking this conflict, right? It was always going to lead to this so long as a special military operation had to then move forward and escalate into something a lot larger than that. So another research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences said that the U.S. and Europe want to enhance NATO's scale and level of solidarity through the crisis and political consensus of supporting Ukraine against Russia, and that's the easiest decision to make. But the members have divergences over concrete agendas, such as Turkey's opposition to Finland and Sweden's membership, not to mention that many have exhausted their equipment reserves. And so Stoltenberg admitted in a German newspaper that Western countries' military and financial support to Kiev is coming to a cost to their societies, a dire cost to their societies. Rising food and energy bills means hard times for European households. New York Times also said on Saturday that the U.S. and NATO scramble to arm Ukraine and refill their own arsenals, saying a NATO official who said that in terms of providing weaponry to Ukraine, smaller countries have exhausted their potential with 20 of its 30 members tapped out. The chairman of NATO Military Committee, Rob Bauer, said strains on stockpiles are across the board, but that Russia is having the same problem, which is arguable. I don't think that Russia is having the same problem. I think that Russia actually, because it's been able to take its time with this, has had a lot more time to get its stockpiles exactly where they need to be. We're not allies on the same page, one advisor told Macron, AFP, forecasting challenging talks with Biden, because Macron right now is meeting with Joe Biden. And that you can see all the disgusting pictures they're taking on social media. We're so much friendly. That's all a charade. NATO emphasized unity at the foreign ministers meeting when they're trying to tamp down widening divergences, adding that a consensus on principles to yield substantial results in actions may be increasingly difficult because of thorny internal problems, which will force country leaders to weigh wins and losses with different perspectives. So while there are reports that U.S. officials are nudging Ukraine to peace talks with Russia, their sincerity is questionable. Sincerity is questionable because the U.S. has made a great fortune by supplying energy to the EU, realizing its goal of containing Russia and strengthening the transatlantic partnership, said Kui Hang, a research fellow at the East China Normal University. So the NATO agenda is very much a U.S.-led one. Bringing the China challenge to the NATO table is not surprising when the U.S. keeps rallying transatlantic allies to its value and ideology. And so, that's what's happening. Basically, NATO is saying that it's committed to Ukraine. It's also committed to opposing China. So NATO is trying to expand both its membership and its scope. And that is very, very, very dangerous. We should all be paying attention to the fact that NATO is not stopping here. While there are incredible costs and there may be setbacks, there may be times in the next several months where NATO has to say, well, we have to cut our losses. We have to be able to scale back just a little bit, even if that just means stagnation and not moving forward. Indeed, NATO is already thinking about how to admit Ukraine into NATO and how to include China in its military activities, in its military interventionism. I mean, that tells you all you need to know about NATO's principal interest. It's to serve the U.S. empire. That's the roots of NATO. That's why NATO exists in the first place. And this isn't ending with the Ukraine crisis and the Ukraine conflict. NATO is not just looking at Ukraine. It's looking at Russia. Its primary adversary is Russia. It's not to defend Ukraine. It's not to allow Ukraine to be protected from so-called Russian invasion. It's not about that. It is about expanding its basis, its membership base. It's to expand its capacity to contain Russia and to get in on, right? To get in on what is increasingly a boon, which is the aggressive posture of the United States toward China. So there are many crisis points here that have not yet been addressed or resolved. You have the economic crisis that is ongoing and only set to escalate and worsen in the coming months because there's really nothing that the U.S. and its European partners can do to make up the shortfall of the Russian energy that's been cut off because of sanctions. So that in and of itself is going to cause the plunge. You'll have a crisis of overproduction because workers will have job loss. They will have wage cuts, which have already been happening. So that's going to cause a general crisis in the economic system. You also have the fact that NATO is out of weapons. NATO can't really, they can promise all of the money in the world to Ukraine, but when those weapons will actually be made and sent to Ukraine is a question. I was listening to Brian Berletic, and he was saying something like, well, Defense News, the Defense Department is saying they might be able to get some of the weapons they promised to Ukraine in 2023 at some point. But it's likely that a lot that are being promised now, it's going to take maybe longer than that. Do I think that Ukraine has until past 2023 to really keep this conflict going? Not really, right? And Ursula, the EU head, her comments about 100,000 Ukrainians having died is a severe underestimation, meaning that you've had probably 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers die in this conflict over 9 months. You're talking about somewhere between 10 to 20,000 per month, right? And now you have hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers, about 200,000, ready to be deployed on the front lines, and that's going to cause even more casualties. And with what weapons will Ukraine's military fight with if they are already blowing through all of the stockpiles that they have been given from the American empire and its vassals in NATO? Very unclear, but it seems like time is ticking for Ukraine, and NATO is just going to continue to try to ride this wave and expand at the expense of NATO.